Hello, thanks for joining us for today's webinar entitled Future-Proofing Enterprise Cybersecurity for AI Vulnerabilities and Business Risks. My name is Corey Williams. I'm the CMO here at Skybox. This event is a discussion of strategies for securing enterprise-facing complex business risks that are reshaping the cybersecurity landscape. These include discussions of artificial intelligence and the rapidly expanding attack surfaces that are combining with an explosion in the number of vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. Today, we are privileged to have with us a distinguished expert in the field of cybersecurity, Graham Cluley. Graham is a renowned independent cybersecurity expert with over 3 decades of experience. Graham is not only a celebrated public speaker and podcaster, but also an analyst and known for his significant contributions to the cybersecurity community, including senior roles at Sophos and McAfee, as well as his introduction into the InfoSecurity Europe Hall of Fame in 2011. We are set for a session today filled with some insights and real-world examples, a discussion that should aid in helping you formulate adaptive and resilient exposure management strategies for your enterprise. Welcome, Graham.
Hello, hello. Real pleasure to be here, Corey. Thank you for that very nice introduction. That was very kind of you.
Thank you.
It's always slightly embarrassing to hear just how many decades you've been working in cybersecurity and still haven't solved the problem. I mean, what have I been doing for 33 odd years? I'm not sure, but maybe it's going to take a little bit longer still.
Well, you made me feel good. I've only been doing this for 27, so I come into this feeling very young.
A whippersnapper.
So today we're going to kind of go through a few of these interesting discussions that are top of mind for cybersecurity experts, and use this as a discussion for how practitioners as well as people kind of in leadership and strategy around security can be thinking about some of these major issues. Why don't we start out with the topic that everyone is discussing today? Even my mom, which rarely gets what I do, is interested in artificial intelligence and what it means. But I think we can focus the conversation a little bit more on the sort of double-edged side of AI. How is it both a benefit and a threat from a cybersecurity perspective? What are some of the lurking dangers? And on the other side, how do you see this improving cybersecurity efforts going forward?
Well, working in IT, and some of us are like CISOs, some of us are developers and programmers, there is a natural instinct to be a real curmudgeon. There's a natural instinct to get really, really grumpy about any new technology which comes along, changes the world, and you think, well, this is it now. This is Skynet. The world is going to end in a ball of flame. And the latest thing which we think is a horrendous invention is, of course, artificial intelligence. And anything transformative like that can be really scary. And there's no doubt, particularly over the last year or so, the whole world has woken up to the potential for artificial intelligence with the advent of deep fakes, with ChatGPT doing things which look like witchcraft, when we first began to see them. So it's understandable that many people will think this is all doom and gloom. I like to be a little bit more balanced about this. I think artificial intelligence, machine learning, these are tools. And just like you can use a tool like a screwdriver for doing lots of good things, or you can use a screwdriver for, poking someone in the ear roll and causing some damage that way, so it is with artificial intelligence as well. So there are bad things which can be done with artificial intelligence. There's no doubt that generative AI is going to help. It's going to augment the cyber criminals' arsenal. It democratizes cyber attacks in many ways to people maybe who aren't as proficient in the English language. They can now use generative AI to help them generate phishes which are more convincing, maybe to launch more attacks simultaneously, things which they previously would have had to do manually. And by the way, it's not just helping people speak English. If you wanted to target people in Italy or someone like that, well, get generative AI to create convincing looking Italian phishes, because most people in Italy probably aren't used to receiving Italian phishing messages or Italian, because most of the time people don't bother. Most of the time, the things they will receive will probably be in English when they're scammy, and that's actually the way they've helped protect themselves. So, yes, there's a lower entry threshold thanks to AI, potentially. And we're going to see more and more people using artificial intelligence to help them commit cybercrimes. But this is what I think, Corey, is that we're also going to see machine learning and AI being used by the security companies to do some of the dog work, to do some of the things which were hard to do in the past, to make intelligent, hopefully, guesses regarding whether something is suspicious or not suspicious, beginning to learn what scams, what malware looks like, what vulnerabilities look like. So there's lots of good stuff which can come out of it as well, but it's still early days. And, I haven't completely drunk the Kool-Aid. I think there's a lot of mistakes which AI and machine learning can make as well. We're some way off, but none of us should think that it's not an interesting new development and something which we're going to see more and more of in the future.
Yeah, we certainly have, as we've kind of done our research and talked to a lot of the cybersecurity leaders that we have as customers and sell to, they certainly see this as an accelerant. It's going to make the volume higher. It's going to make the sophistication a little bit better. But it's not a fully automated solution. It's a lot like when Google came along. They made it easier to cyber stalk someone because you can find out where they live much easier than going through the white pages and trial and error that in the old phone book. And I think it's the same thing with artificial intelligence. It's certainly going to accelerate the thing. But at the end of the day, the techniques are very similar, right? They're launching attacks against identity. They're launching attacks against vulnerabilities, known and unknown. They can just do it in higher volumes and in a more automated way.
And the sad truth is that cyber criminals don't actually need to use deepfake technology and artificial intelligence to trick someone in your company from opening an attachment or clicking on a link or being phished or stealing your data or business email compromise. The old-fashioned methods still work really, really well. So do they actually need to use this kind of technology? They seem to be doing all right for themselves using old-fashioned techniques.
Yeah, and I do think it's good on the white hat side. I do think there's a need to embrace and understand new technologies so that you can respond to the threats that are coming from them as they go, as they develop, as they emerge from the use of new technology. And to your point, that the kind of mundane, kind of normal cybersecurity hygiene issues or cybersecurity kind of known solutions, if they're not put into place and into practice, you end up with situations like Equifax. And I know it's been a couple of years, but maybe it's worth kind of reminding everyone, what happened at Equifax, kind of what led to this, what could have been done differently. I think it's a great example about how vulnerabilities are left unchecked become a major potential source of security risk for your organization. So let's talk about vulnerabilities a little bit.
So what happened with Equifax specifically is they had a vulnerability in their online dispute web portal. And that was a vulnerability in Apache's struts, the software which they were using. And it allowed the hackers, who I think they've identified eventually were Chinese state-sponsored hackers, people working for the People's Liberation Army. They managed to steal the sensitive personal information of more than 150 million people. And that information included social security numbers, it included addresses and dates of birth, driving license data, credit card information. The FBI described it as the largest theft ever by state-sponsored hackers. And they also stole databases, trade secrets. It looks really bad. But what really looked bad for Equifax's IT security team was that they knew about the security hole. They knew they were vulnerable. There had been a patch released. So it was out there. It was a critical vulnerability, which was known about, and it didn't get fixed. For months, they left it vulnerable. So the entire breach could have been avoided if they'd prioritized it, if they'd recognized that they had this well, they didn't know they had the vulnerability, if they'd actually prioritized it to patch the vulnerability. And there were a number of other problems as well, which emerged as a result of all this. I remember in the inquiry, it was found, the security team, it found out that they had an admin password, which was just the word admin, which frankly, isn't great. The CISO, the CIO, they retired immediately after the impact. And there were even some staff, senior staff inside Equifax, who were later found guilty of insider trading because they knew about the breach before it was made public. And they made some interesting stock investments, knowing that their share price was going to fall when it did get made public. Astonishing thing to do. But, this is just one story of a company getting hacked. But the truth is that there are so many vulnerabilities. In 2022 alone, it's estimated there were around about 25,000 new vulnerabilities officially identified. That's something like 70 every single day of the year, including Christmas Day and all those holidays. There's new vulnerabilities. So this is not a problem that's getting smaller. Keeping on top of the volume of vulnerabilities and maybe prioritizing them, working out which ones you have to patch, which ones you should mitigate against, what other controls you could put in place to avoid those problems becomes really, really important for IT departments. It's a big headache for companies.
It kind of reminds me too that what happened at Equifax sounds very, like there was a lack of controls, and they knew about this vulnerability because it had been identified. It took months, and they still hadn't patched it. But that's actually a very commonplace scenario in most enterprises. The simple example is that the scanners that are used to detect these vulnerabilities, they're only run periodically because they cause a resource drain, and the performance of the system can go down if you're constantly scanning on it. So they only schedule these every week or month or 6 months. And when that happens, there's a lag between the time that vulnerability exists and when your scanner detects it. Then there's the opposite problem, which is, okay, now I know about it. Even if I know it's a high priority, I may not be allowed to patch that system because patches often require a restart of a server. And if I'm a retail company, I don't do anything to update my systems during the holiday period, which we're in right now. And so you end up with these two lags on the best way to mitigate these vulnerabilities, which is to detect them and to patch them. There's a lag that happens on both sides of that detect and patch that's really hard to avoid from a business operations point of view. And so I do think it's a challenge that, while it sounds bad for Equifax that they knew about it and didn't patch it, I suspect that's an issue for most enterprises.
I think you're right. I think it's really easy to beat up on the IT security team and, frankly, have a good laugh, say, haha, but, there but for the grace of God go all of us, right? It's easy to have some schadenfreude there and think, well, I'm glad it happened to them, but it could happen to any of us, because what you've just described is completely normal, where there are competing priorities inside the company. And without a doubt, if your company needs to be online, needs to be up and running, you are not going to be very keen when the IT department says, well, we'd like to reboot the servers in order to install this particular patch, or we need to do this. And even though the CISO, there was some mistake, having the password for the admin account be admin certainly is pretty unforgivable, frankly. Yeah. But the other things may have been that people higher up in the company were not giving that IT department enough budget, weren't giving them enough resource to handle some of these issues. So there's all kinds of constraints on people. And, as you've just described, not being able to scan on a regular basis for vulnerable devices, when you've got people inside your company off premises, on premises, wired and wireless, constantly adding or removing devices from your network, all of these present an opportunity for malicious hackers to take advantage of improperly secured systems. So it is sometimes a bit of a game of whack-a-mole, but you've got your hands tied behind your back, so you can't actually use that ruddy hammer to try and hit the mole. So it's complicated, and we accept that. What we have to do in the security industry is work better together to produce resources and tools and services which allow us to do this kind of job properly with a minimum disruption to the business as a whole, because obviously the business is there to make money. It needs to be up and running.
And businesses, their core competency isn't necessarily cybersecurity. They hire experts, they rely on third parties, but they're in the business of producing goods and services that aren't related to cybersecurity. And so it does become a challenge. I do think that it's all exacerbated by the point you brought up, which is thousands of new vulnerabilities are coming into play. But it's not just those tens of thousands of vulnerabilities, it's times the number of instances that exist in your enterprise. So I might, that 25,000 new vulnerabilities might turn into 250,000 instances within my organization. And so, at some point there has to be a better way of just them patching everything, which, as we know, is not a complete solution. And we'll talk about some of that in the questions we go forward. Like, what are some additional approaches that you can, add some layers of defense and depth. But the one striking thing about Equifax is that the dispute resolution application breach somehow exposes dozens of servers and systems within their organization that they didn't have the controls behind that to reduce to mitigate the issue of that kind of innocuous application being breached.
Absolutely. I mean, this is so commonly what we hear, isn't it? Is that there'll be some kind of security breach and the hackers use that as their foothold inside your company to then spread laterally further into your organization, accessing databases, accessing accounts which they shouldn't have had access to. So if you can put the structure in place inside your infrastructure, inside your network, preventing people from moving in that way, of having access to things that they shouldn't have access to, then you can begin to contain and attack. I don't think any of us are actually saying, we're looking for 100% security here. It's if we believed that 100% security was really possible, none of us would get up in the morning, we wouldn't get into our cars, we wouldn't drive down the motorway. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to make it manageable. So sure, we might sometimes have an intrusion. There may sometimes be a phishing message. What we need to do is make it have as small an impact as possible and not have the kind of disaster which Equifax and far too many organizations do suffer from on a regular basis.
Yeah, agreed. So you kind of mentioned a point in that last question around seeing devices coming onto and off the network and all of the kind of forces related to that. I mean, in your discussions and travels and research, how crucial is it to have an understanding of what's on your network and be able to have that kind of comprehensive view to begin with to fuel your cybersecurity strategies?
It's absolutely critical. It really is. I mean, I can't put it any more straightforwardly than that. It's so essential that you know what is attached to your network, that you know what servers you have, what computers you have, what devices, what is being plugged in, to have some sort of oversight of that. Because otherwise, I mean, you really are blind. You really don't know what you have. And you have this problem compounded as well when sometimes, there will be departments inside your company which are frustrated by the IT guys, because the IT guys, sadly, are often perceived as the people who say, no, you can't do that, or we have a way of doing this, and we can build that little microsite for you, but it will take us 9 months because we're working on all these other projects as well. And then you have departments who say, oh, well, my cousin Trevor knows a bit of HTML. He can build us a little microsite where our customers can enter our data. And before, obviously, it's insecure or there's some kind of weakness on it. You don't even know inside the IT department that this thing has been built. You don't have visibility on what's going on here, and yet your customers' data is being entered into it or
Yep.
being mangled in some way. So, yeah, you need visibility as to the devices, as to the servers, as to basically everything, which you have to have some sort of oversight of what's going on in your network, because otherwise, how on earth are you going to deal with problems? How are you going to know that
Right.
there's a vulnerability in XYZ portal which might be exploited, or a SQL injection flaw on something, if you didn't even know you owned that domain name
Yeah.
because someone else went and registered it?
There's an additional layer even within IT, assuming that IT is centralized, which often it is not. It's often decentralized in larger organizations. But even within a centralized IT department, you end up with a lot of different silos or perspectives of data as to what's on your network. The network team knows its network devices. The database team knows it's the VMware team knows all the Unix servers that they're hosting the
Yeah.
VMware on, but they don't know all the containers that are being run on top of VMware. So, it goes on and on and on. The inventory is a challenge because it's so locked up in different silos. And the context of a breach on a network, you talked about the blast radius. If you don't know what's on the network from all those different perspectives, then you don't know what the blast radius is, right? This device gets compromised. How many things can be accessed to and from it? And that's a challenge if you have things locked up in silos and don't have it aggregated into a kind of rationalized view of what's in your environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it must be I'm very pleased to say that, yeah, I am an IT security manager, but I'm an IT security manager at a company of one person, which is me. So I've pretty much got good visibility on most of the devices plugged into my network. But boy, oh boy, imagine, when you work at one of these large companies, if you don't have the right tools, if you don't have the right visibility on what's connecting to your network, who'd want to do this job that we're doing? I'm not sure many of us would.
Right. So yeah, I mean, a good starting point is a good map, right? Before you start this
Yeah.
journey, you got to
Yep.
know where you're going, and what is there. Yeah, and you mentioned up earlier, and it's kind of funny. I mean, yeah, we kind of went over these questions beforehand, but the fact is that um, you answer one question, it opens up another one, and I think we should talk a little bit about prioritization. The fact is that the complexity of the environment, the number of assets that are there, the number of vulnerabilities instances that may occur, you can't just patch everything. That is an ideal goal, but I think we have moved beyond the rational ability for that to happen. We're creating 1,000-year problems when we have that mindset. And so that at some point you've got to understand what the risk is to your individual organization. I mean, how do you think an organization should go about bridging some of those gaps?
Well, first of all, as we've just described, you've got to know what you've got. In
Yep.
order to know how vulnerable you actually are, you have to know what devices they're on. You have to know what software they're running, what combinations of hardware and software are they running, how up to date they are, so on and so forth. And that way you can cut a swathe through some of these vulnerabilities and say, well, simply, we're not using that operating system. We're not using that tool. That library isn't in use in any of our projects. Therefore, we don't have to worry about that particular thing. That's a big advantage right there if you're able to do that. But I think as well as that, what you probably want to do is bring in a bit of expertise. There are companies out there who can help you in terms of, okay, rather than patching every single vulnerability, which frankly isn't going to be possible, to do it in a timely fashion, which doesn't disrupt the rest of your company. So what other mitigations can be put in place? How else can we actually reduce that threat? Sometimes you will come across a vulnerability which has been classified as uber critical, full brown alert. This is the one we have to worry about. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be that level of seriousness inside your organization. So it's almost like you have to work out where the threat context is for your particular setup, what you need to worry about in that regard. And if you don't do that, I mean, the impact can be very serious. I mean, on this slide, we're talking about the sunburst attack, which happened against SolarWinds, which is really horrendously serious. There was nothing really that the customers of SolarWinds did wrong. It's not as though that they were just receiving an update from a supplier who they trusted, but the supplier unfortunately had been hacked.
Yeah, I think you bring up the context of the business is so important. Understanding what a particular asset means to your organization to focus your efforts in terms of triangulating there. And it's not about how serious the vulnerability is. It's about how serious the impact is if that vulnerability was to be exploited. And
Yeah,
and that requires an individualized view from the risk profile of that business. Okay, Equifax, thank you. Second, third largest volume of data compromised. There should have been some business risk understanding that data was accessible through the exploits of this particular application. That's context that nobody else would know. It's not related to how serious the vulnerability in the application was in the struts thing. It wasn't related to the severity of that vulnerability. It was everything related to, if this was compromised, what's it connected to? And I think that is understanding that. I actually think that we're going to start to see that peek into the different regulatory bodies. They're going to start to say you need to have an understanding of risk, not just of technical severity of what's going on in your environment. You're seeing that in a lot of draft legislation out of Singapore, out of the EU, out of the U.S. government and financial regulators. I haven't seen anything. I don't know if you know. I haven't seen anything codified yet, but I've seen it in drafts, and I think that you have to consider risk to your business and to your customers. In the case of SolarWinds, it was their risk to that system and how many people it connected to.
yeah.
That's the issue that SolarWinds didn't take into account.
So the way I like to think about it is you need to think about, what are your crown jewels? What can you not risk being compromised or stolen under any circumstances? What is the lifeblood of your organization? Okay, so for many companies, it will be something like their customer list, right? Or the information about their customer. Certainly in the case of Equifax, they have these huge databases of hundreds of millions of people, lots of very sensitive information. That was the thing which could not be lost under any circumstances, because the damage to their brand and their reputation was enormous. With other companies, it may be their database, it may be some trade secrets or intellectual property. It may be that the thing they can't afford to lose is for their website to go down. If they do if you're Amazon or something like that, right, the website always has to be up. We can't have the website down because we lose a fortune if it goes down. In the case of SolarWinds, what was really essential to them was that one of their key assets was that they had this update process. So SolarWinds, for anyone who doesn't know, billion-dollar company, manages the network infrastructure for just about everybody. Over 425 members of the US Fortune 500 are using SolarWinds software. Top 10 US telecoms companies, the President's Office, Microsoft, Intel, Google, the list goes on and on and on. And what the hackers did was they managed to break into SolarWinds' server. Again, another dumb password, on this occasion, posted publicly in a GitHub repository, hard-coded in some code. So, oh dear, bit of a goof there. And the hackers got in and they were able to install a malicious software update called Sunburst into the software supply chain, which meant that all of those customers, all of those big companies who were using SolarWinds solutions were pushed out a trusted update which actually contained something malicious, which installed a remote access Trojan on all of their servers. And then the hackers were able to ferret around and steal information from all of those victims as well. So that was the thing. That was one of the things inside that company they should have identified as, this is the thing which is sacrosanct. This is the thing which can never be compromised. We absolutely have to treat this like the crown jewels.
Yeah. Yeah,
so every company, you're right, every company needs to go through that process of what's the thing we can't risk losing.
Right. And I mean, it's one thing if a vulnerability exposes my payroll system and my employees can't get paid, but that creates a big issue inside my company. It's a whole nother thing if I'm a third party supplier, and I'm in effect bringing down all my customers' solutions. That it's just orders of magnitude different.
Yeah.
And so I think that there has to be some, you know, evaluation of what's important to a business as the context of where you start. Now I've got all of these things. If I have to choose between patching this and patching that, let's patch the one that's going to save our customers all that headache first, save our revenue second, and then save employee headaches third. And I think that kind of prioritization is important. There's probably other aspects of prioritization that are important from a technical point of view, like is this likely to be exploited? You know, is it even reachable from a third party? Right? If it's on an air gap network, then maybe it's not as high a technical priority, even if it's a very high from a from a nuclear power plant. It doesn't run on the internet. But don't want those vulnerabilities to be there in case someone walks in a USB key. And so I think that's a unique profile that has to be developed for each organization, and it's a sophistication level that we're not seeing well implemented at most of the customers we talk to. Some are taking it very seriously. Most are still they're still drowning in just identifying all the vulnerabilities and then saying half of them are critical to patch. And that's just not it's just not possible for them. So they just do the best they can. The concern is, liability beyond just, so the stakes are high for the business, but they're also high for the leadership. More so than on the business side, potentially. On the business side, it's, you hear about cases of, not reporting things accurately to the board or to investors, and financial crimes. But these are outside your influence. You've got to take this prioritization seriously and show that you have made efforts in that direction.
Yeah.
So, okay. So a little bit of doom and gloom we went through. I think there's some best practices we kind of mentioned. One is having good visibility into what's on your network, having a better context as to what the risk is to your business, some of the limitations of the best way to remediate, which is to keep your systems up to date with the latest patches and security, right? We know that's good cyber hygiene, but we also kind of illustrated how it's not enough. What's your thoughts on defense in depth? What does that look like? What are some tips or pointers you can give listeners about how you kind of go about not relying on just a firewall or just a patching system or just whatever we tend to kind of silver bullet cybersecurity with sometimes?
Yeah, I'd like to think that we've passed those days by now. I remember in the early days, in the early 1990s, when I entered this profession, what we did back then was we'd have a foot bath machine, or also sometimes called a sheep dip, and every floppy disk which came into the company, because we were a paranoid security company, we didn't want to get infected by anything. Every piece of media which came into the company had to go through this computer, where it was scanned by about 12 different antivirus products before we would allow it to be used on any of our other computers. And that was it. There wasn't really very much more than that. But if something got past that check, then it wasn't checked again. But of course, the antivirus software on that sheep dip machine was only as up to date as it was. If there was a new piece of malware, it could have waltzed past that and begun to spread inside our organization. And we wouldn't have known about it necessarily. So you want to keep on doing checks. It's just like if you have a bunch of ne'er-do-wells and prisoners, you don't just chuck them into a great big quadrangle and build an enormous wall around them and have one gate with one guard. But you'll notice that if you watch any of these TV shows about prisons, there's locked doors everywhere. So if someone does manage to get past one bar or, one door, they will hopefully be contained within another area. And so there's different perimeters. And that, if you can emulate that number of checks inside your network, if you have an environment where you're not trusting anything, which comes through, it's like, oh no, we're going to check you again. Then that's probably going to be better, I think. So yeah, don't put all your eggs in one basket. The attacks these days are so sophisticated. You can't just have one guard. You need frequent checks, and you need defense in depth.
Yeah, I don't know if it's oversimplifying it, but I think cyber attackers are a little bit like water flowing downhill. They're going to search out the path of least resistance and find every crack to flow into. And so you need to have a continued set of checks against that. Just like you would waterproof your house, you wouldn't just do it with a tarp. You put multiple layers of waterproofing to do that.
I think that's a great analogy. Water always finds a way, doesn't it? It will always, if there's a weak point, it will get through it.
Right. And we know that for a lot of these cases, the weak points are people, right? So phishing attacks and social engineering attacks. That's why if a person is compromised, you need depth behind it. My expertise over the last 20 years comes a lot of that identity and access management space. And in that space, there's a lot of talk about zero trust, which in its essence is you can't just identify someone once and assume that's who they are. You need multiple factors of ways to do that. And then you need to not assume that just because you've identified them once that they should have access to everything, but that they should continue to be verified and validated as they go along. I think the same thing is true of the rest of the rest of this. So just because a server is up to date and patched doesn't mean that you shouldn't have controls that limit access from that system to other systems it doesn't need to have access to. You need to have the network controls in place, the intrusion detection prevention kind of controls up to date. Even certain things like network configuration, whether it be like segmentation or closing ports or all that kind of stuff. In addition to the scanning and patching for vulnerabilities, I think they all work in harmony together. And
it's not just identifying if something is trusted or not as well.
Correct.
It's also about identifying whether its behavior is trusted. So you may trust a device, a server, a computer, whatever, to access the database and get a record. But if suddenly, out of the blue, there's some anomalous behavior, like, hang on, that computer is now accessing 2 million records. What on earth is it doing? So even though we trust it to access the database, it's doing something with the database which is a bit odd.
Yes.
Why is it doing that?
Yeah.
And I think that's a good something which raises suspicions and rings alarm bells.
Yeah, it's not just the static state of a particular asset, but it's the behavior of that asset in flight. Is it doing what is expected? And that's a good lesson out of identity as well, but that we can apply to the network, to individual systems, to applications. No, I think that's a good point. I wanted to kind of switch gears and kind of close by taking if you'll forgive me for quoting another analyst, this continuous threat exposure management program that's defined by Gartner. I think it's an element of it's a kind of a term that addresses a lot of the elements we talked about today. And it's defined as a set of processes and capabilities that allow enterprises to continuously and consistently evaluate the accessibility, exposure, and exploitability of an enterprise's digital and physical assets. And I think it's that triple there, the accessibility, exposure, and exploitability that kind of sums up what we were talking about. What is this system? Where's this system in your environment? Do you know about it? Can it be accessed through any path in the network? Is it exposed, right? Does it have a vulnerability that is not patched? Is it exploitable? What's the threat intelligence about that vulnerability? Is it being used in the wild? Is it targeting this particular asset? And so I think it's kind of interesting that there are some efforts by firms to start to talk about exposure management, not as a tool or a product, but actually as a program or as a process. And it goes beyond just the vulnerabilities that are software, kind of vulnerabilities, but there actually could be misconfigurations. They could be excess access permissions. It could be, too flat of a network. All of those things end up kind of being something that need to be addressed as exposures and put into context for where you can apply that limited set of resources you have to mitigate, these exposures. There's a lot of talk about automation and how we're going to have to automate a lot of this. I think some of it's automatable, but most of it still needs a human decision maker in the loop, because you can't just automatically patch a system and reboot a server that doesn't have any of the business context in it, right? I can't bring down Walmart's e-commerce system, on Black Friday because some automation told me it was okay. So I think that I bring this up because I think it's a program. It's a growing kind of approach that summarizes a lot of the points that we talked about today. And it's worth, I think, for listeners to look into and kind of evaluate how their landscape of tools and processes and people are helping to address some of the issues that we brought up today.
Sounds good.
Let me just wrap up by saying I really appreciate you joining us here today, and thank you also to the attendees of the webinar. Skybox, no surprise, we actually are ourselves experts and help a lot of hundreds of large organizations implement continuous exposure management programs that address a lot of the challenges we talked about today. If you'd like to learn more about Skybox and the exposure management solutions we can help you provide, please visit us at skyboxsecurity.com. Or if you'd like to know more about Graham Cluley, who I appreciate you joining us here today, you can reach him at his website, grahamcluley.com. He's also on many different of the social media networks, including LinkedIn and Twitter and all the rest. I really appreciate your time here today, Graham. I enjoyed our discussion.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in as well.
Yeah, thanks.